Yeah, we can. I think we can start. Okay, Steve, Francis, let's get ready to start. Okay. Hello, good morning, good afternoon to the European colleague, and good evening to the Asian colleagues. So welcome again to this World River and Delta System Source to Think webinar series. Today, we have a very special joint talk given by Professor Stephen Darby and Francis Dunn, and talk about the global scale, the fluvial sediment supply to the world delta, and how it's changing and why it matters. So Professor Steve Darby is a physical geographer in the University of Southampton. Steve originally graduated from Queen Mary, London, and then moved the PhD to pursue his PhD in University of Nottingham and Professor Colin Sonin. So during his PhD, Steve developed the first morphodynamic model to couple the water flow and the sediment transport. And after his PhD, Steve had a postdoc position in University of Florence in Italy, and then also working as a research geologist in Oxford, Mississippi. So they moved back to Southampton in 1997, and since then, as we know, Steve is his career is working on a number of topics, particularly the river bank erosion, biogeomorphology, even the oceanic turbidity current. And so particularly the last decade, he mainly focused on the Southeastern Asia, particularly the Mekong River. And this somehow we get to know each other in the last couple of years when we work on the Mekong project. And he's mainly work on the river portion. We work on the near shore and on the shelf. And he, through the collaboration, they try to understand the delta sustainability and also coupled the social and ecological systems. And Dr. Frances Dunn is, she was a student of Steve, and so currently she is a postdoc at Utrecht University, Netherlands. Frances completed her bachelor and master at the University of Manchester, and then before he moved to the University of Southampton, working with Steve and Robert Nichols. So she also have a short postdoc at Southampton, and before moved to the Utrecht in 2 years ago. And so she's currently working on a model try to improve our understanding about how the fluvial flux, global large scale, and also the hydrological management. So today we are very happy they will give us a joint talk back and forth. So maybe a little bit longer, that will be great. This is our great Thanksgiving feast. So we come here to join together. So Steve, please, before next week. And we also have two great talks next week. This coming Friday, we don't have a seminar this Friday because it's Thanksgiving, it's Black Friday. Even I don't shopping anymore, but it's crazy. So next week, we have two more talks given by Steve Goodbread. Of course, he will talk about Ganges Brahmaputra, and also Peter Clift. We talk also the Himalaya, the Indus River. So it's a great talk, in that area. Please mark your calendar next Wednesday and Friday, given by Steve Goodbread and Peter Clift. So Steve, now you can share your screen.
Okay, so hopefully that's you can see that. So I'll be grateful if somebody can give me a shout when you can see the slides. Thank you.
Yeah, it's very good. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, for the introduction, and thanks everybody for joining as well, wherever you are. And if you're in the States, happy Thanksgiving for tomorrow. So look, as Paul said, this is a joint talk. Francis, we're going to try and hand over between different parts of the talk, so bear with us if there are some clunky transitions. But as you can see, our talk's called Fluvial Sediment Supply to the World's River Deltas, and Francis is going to talk about her work understanding how across the world these fluvial sediment fluxes and how they're changing into the future and what are driving those changes. Whereas I'll focus more on a little bit of a case study of the Mekong Delta, which you can see behind the title here, examining the implications of the changes of sediment loads for agriculture and livelihoods in the Delta system. So as means of a little bit of context to get us started, I'm sure that many of you will be very familiar with this slide that comes from what's turned into a bit of a citation classic, the Sinking Deltas paper by Savitsky and others. And what this graphic does in a very effective way is to demonstrate the rather obvious but nonetheless important point that deltaic environments are very vulnerable, because as low relief, low elevation landscapes, then clearly they are susceptible to the adverse impacts of rising sea levels. And that's demonstrated across, you can pick out your favorite delta from these insets here, but essentially the gray lines that you can see marked on some of these images from the SRTM data are the 2 meter above sea level contour. So there are very large areas of land in these delta systems that are within just 2 meters of mean sea level at the moment. And that's important not just in terms of the possibility of increased flood risk, but millions of people live in these environments as well. And those people are very often dependent for their livelihoods on agricultural activities as well as other economic activities in these deltas. But even beyond the immediate local impact of the possible drowning of these delta systems, then the fact that these are agricultural hotspots of food production, that has implications not just regionally, but globally, as we'll talk a little bit about later in the talk. Now, in terms of the drivers of relative sea level change in these deltas, again, this cartoon, again, crediting Savitsky here, shows that the principal drivers of what's going on in these delta systems. So we've got a nice little, very simple profile through our cartoon delta here. So on the one hand, we have rising global sea levels driven by essentially climate change through a combination of the thermal expansion of the oceans, melting ice from the land masses as well, giving us a sea level rise of something of the order of a few millimeters per year. On the other hand, deltas of course sink under their own weight as they compact, rather gradual rates of natural subsidence. But again, as we'll see for the Mekong later and across many of the world's deltas, probably the dominant source of relative sea level change in contemporary deltas is anthropogenic subsidence, accelerated subsidence typically induced by the mining of groundwater, perhaps the oxidation of peat in many delta environments as well. And we will see examples showing that this is indeed typically the dominant driver of relative sea level rise. Then if we ignore for a moment any crustal deformations from tectonics or other factors, then the other factor influencing relative sea level rise is of course the net sediment deposition on the surface of our deltas. And of course the first order control on that is the supply of sediment from the river basins upstream. And so really the key point here is to show that immediately it's worth rehearsing the rather obvious point that a key control on relative sea level rise, and really the only factor that can potentially offset rising sea levels in many deltas, is the potential for sediment deposition, largely controlled in turn by how much sediment is being discharged from the rivers upstream. So that's why understanding what that sediment flux is obviously pretty important. And actually we have a pretty good idea across a range of deltas about how those fluxes might have changed in the past. So for a selection of deltas on the left here, we have time marching from the past to the present, moving from right to left on this scale. And we can see that for many of the world's deltas, there's a kind of a consistent pattern of past variability in flux, where we see a period of human impact associated primarily with deforestation and soil erosion associated with agriculture, where we have rising sediment fluxes before we get to a point where soil conservation measures kick in, also the effects of damming for other water resources management, and then declining sediment fluxes in recent decades. And that's reflected on the right here in this cartoon, showing that we understand or have an understanding of the drivers of this pathway of past sediment delivery. The exact timing of this will vary from place to place, and not every place will follow exactly this trajectory, but we can see that we have a kind of an economic Kunze type curve going on here, with this increase associated with really significant mismanagement of the environment following a subsequent, and then a subsequent decrease as these soil conservation techniques kick in. So as I say, we do have an understanding of past flux, but what we're really interested in for this talk is how can we, the key question, I guess, is what's going to happen into the future. And that's where we're going to do our first transition, where Frances will pick up here and talk about the work that she's led on modeling these fluxes into the future. So we'll just do a little unshare of my screen and pass to Frances. Over to you, Frances.
Great, thanks, Steve. Okay. Slideshow visible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Okay, so yeah, we've heard from Steve about why it's important, why sediment delivery to deltas is important, and how they have been known to change in the past. But crucially, we want to know how they're going to change in the future. So in this part, I'm going to be presenting mostly published work from the paper and the citation you can see at the bottom, which was also mostly my PhD work. So what we did was used a global hydrological model, WBMZ, which gives climate-driven water discharge, and on top of that also produces sediment fluxes. And this was set up at a global scale, quite core scale. The sediment delivery module is BQuart for anyone who's familiar with it. I imagine quite a lot of people in this audience. And the map here shows, just an example output. It gives discharge for each cell, but obviously you can focus in on cells over a certain discharge so that you know you're looking at actual rivers. And for this work, we looked at the delivery to 47 deltas worldwide, and that's the delivery at the apexes of the delta, so where the major rivers entered the delta area, rather than delivery to the sea or further upstream or within the delta. So this is the only equation I'm going to show, so that you know where this sediment delivery is coming from. It's a fairly simple equation. It's just all multiplicative, so you don't need to focus very hard. But I wanted to highlight some key interesting inputs. And here they are: the reservoir sediment trapping efficiency, which is a huge part of the future scenarios that I constructed, and I'm going to be talking about more later. There's also the anthropogenic factor, which is, I think, one of the most interesting parts, and also the least well constrained, which I'll also talk about later because I incorporated that into scenarios. And finally, this equation on the screen is for average annual temperatures above 2 degrees C. And the only difference with the below 2 degrees C temperature is that you ignore the temperature. So that's the end of the equation. That's fine. So for the setup of WBMZ, we obviously used a lot of global data sets. I set up the scenarios to include climate change, socioeconomic change, and that's the wealth per population, and also population density, and that's what feeds into the anthropogenic factor, which I mentioned on the previous slide. So the idea is that low population densities are unlikely to have any significant effect on sediment delivery to deltas, and whereas high population densities will have an effect, but the effect they have depends on their wealth. So as the graph on one of Steve's slides showed, in poorer societies, as they develop, they tend to increase sediment load, but as they get richer, it starts to decrease again. So that's all there is to this. It's just that high density, poor populations have an increasing effect on sediment delivery, and high density low populations have a decreasing effect. The only other aspect of the scenarios here is the dam scenario. So that's reservoir construction. So obviously the more reservoirs are constructed in a basin, the more sediment is trapped and the less gets to the delta. And we validated this model for the period of the 90s where available. Now for the sediment, there was, for these 47 deltas worldwide, there was often only a single value, annual average value, so we just took what we could. But for the water, we did also have to sometimes go back to the 1970s to get any consistent data time series. And finally, we ran the whole thing from 1980 to the end of the century to do the validation and also scenarios. And these are the results of the validation. You can see on the left the water discharge, and that's pretty well constrained. So the solid line is the one-to-one line, and the dashed lines are the order of magnitude bounds. So you can see everything is within an order of magnitude for the 47 deltas, and for a global model, that's pretty good. We were quite pleased with that. And on the right, you can see the sediment validation, and obviously the sediment equation takes the water discharge from the model. So the additional factors in the sediment equation do introduce a little more variability. So there are a few points which lie outside the order of magnitude lines, but overall very happy considering the limited calibration available for this kind of global model. So talking a bit more about these scenarios, this is a map to show both the existing reservoirs in white, which were included in the model from the GRAND database, and also the future dams on which data was available, which we included in the scenarios. So the future dams are from Christian Zaffel's data set, and they are dams which are either under construction or planned, specifically with hydropower usage, and they all have a larger than 1 megawatt capacity. And that was the data that was available for that. So to make that useful, For the hydrological model, we used an equation, just a basic regression from dams for which the volume of the reservoir and the hydropower capacity was known, just to link those. So that's where the volumes for input for the scenarios came from. For the rest of the scenario aspects, I didn't say on the previous slide, there is a single reservoir construction scenario. So that runs through all of these 12 scenarios that you can see on this slide. And the other aspects of these 12 scenarios are the climate change, which comes from the 4 representative concentration pathways along the top, and the socioeconomic change, which affects the anthropogenic factor, as I said before, and that's along the side. And we used SSPs 1 to 3. And you can see this creates a matrix from a scenario of low climate change and low socioeconomic challenges to high climate change and high socioeconomic challenges and everything in between. So if you keep an eye on this matrix and I switch to the next slide, you'll see the results in total from the 47 deltas. So this is the total reduction over the 21st century to the 47 deltas. And first of all, you can see between the most extreme scenarios, there isn't actually a huge amount of difference. It's a reduction of between 2.2 and 2.7 billion tons per year. Which is between 34 and 41%. The other thing that's interesting to note here is that if I switch back to the previous slide with the explanations of the scenarios, the top left corner, the low climate change, low socioeconomic challenges scenario, actually has the highest reduction in sediment delivery to these deltas, whereas the scenario in the bottom right corner with the highest climate change and highest socioeconomic challenges gives the lowest reduction. Now that may be a little counterintuitive, but it makes sense considering the assumptions of the equation. So the assumption is that higher temperatures will lead to increased sediment delivery due to chemical weathering is the process in the model, but also in theory due to increased precipitation intensity and other aspects of climate change. So that's why higher climate change actually leads to a lower decrease in sediment delivery, but also on the socioeconomic side, if there are higher socioeconomic challenges, communities will be less rich and societies will do less useful things for themselves. They'll be able to do less things like soil and water conservation and appropriate channel engineering. So they will themselves be able to reduce the sediment flux less. So this is the map of the 47 deltas showing the same changes over the 21st century. And what you can see here is it's mostly negative. So here blue is negative, green is positive. The filled circles are the average of the 12 scenarios, and the empty circles are the maximum and minimum change for each delta. So that might be a different scenario for each delta, but it gives you the range. And you can see in some places, for instance, in the Europe inset, there's the number 31 and 34, which is the Po and the Rhone. They have actually a different color maximum and minimum. So in some scenarios, there might be an increase, and in some there might be a decrease. But for most of the deltas worldwide, it is consistent. And if you look, for instance, across the large Asian deltas with these very high population densities, there is a lot of large decreases going on. The other thing to point out here is the one large increase, number 17, is the Limpopo in southern Africa. And that's not weird. I looked into it. It's just particularly sensitive to climate change, and also has no dams that we know of planned to be built in the basin, and also has no significant socioeconomic change. So that is just an example of what could happen in a basin which is sensitive to climate change and which has no significant anthropogenic changes over the century. These graphs are the same data as the map, but presented slightly differently, in case that's easier for some people to look at. So the top graph is the percentage change, and the bottom graph is the absolute change, and the deltas are ordered in the same way for clarity. So you can see for the percentage change graph, again, mostly negative. There's few positive decreases there are small, and then you have the Limpopo at the end. And if you look at the bottom graph, the absolute change, it's a little more difficult to look at because it's a log scale. So because of the very large range of delta and river sizes that we looked at, we wanted to include a broad variety, but it does make it difficult to fit them all on one graph. So just to point out a few things here, if you look at approximately the middle, the Amazon, this tall one here, this is interesting because obviously the Amazon has a huge sediment load, and the decrease is also very large. You can see that's the decreases. You can see it via the hollow bit of the bar at the top. But it's in the middle of the graph, so it corresponds to this bar up here in the top graph, which is, as a percentage, it's fairly small. So the point is that the percentage decrease for the Amazon for itself is much less significant. But if you look at global sediment delivery to deltas, this change is huge, and this also could potentially correspond to sediment delivery to the global ocean. So what changes which might be significant for individual rivers may not be for the globe, and vice versa. So those were the scenario results, but we also looked at the individual drivers themselves. So we did additional runs with each scenario driver individually. And here you can see again the total for all 47 deltas, the total change, both absolute and percentage. The top four you can see in green, those are positive, and they are the climate change projections. So if there was only climate change of any kind, of any magnitude, there would be a small increase in total to these deltas. Between 7.4 and 11.6%. But all the rest of the drivers are in red below, meaning that they're negative. So the next three are the socioeconomic scenarios, SSPs 1 to 3, and they give a slightly larger negative influence on average than climate change. But the very bottom line, reservoir construction, you can see outweighs all of the rest. So if there was no climate change or socioeconomic change, but only reservoir construction, the sediment delivery to these deltas would still decrease by almost 30%, which is the majority of the change that we observed. And to break this out per delta, so these are the three drivers, the magnitudes of the three drivers for each delta. And if you look very closely, you'll see that some of them add up to more than 100%. And that's because we did all these runs separately. So for instance, if there is socioeconomic change which decreases the sediment load and reservoir construction, they could both influence it more than they would individually. So they actually add up to remove more than 100% of the river sediment load, but obviously that doesn't happen in real life. So if we look a bit closer at this graph, the dam construction is in the light blue, and that's the only driver which can only be negative. So the other ones have the potential to be positive or negative. But you can see that on the positive side, there is only climate change, which is the mid blue, and most of those positives are very small. There's just two which are larger, and one is the Limpopo here, which I pointed out previously on the map, and the other one is the Krishna. And that's interesting because it didn't stand out on the map, but that's, if you look, because in the scenario runs, this increase due to climate change was balanced out by a huge decrease due to socioeconomic change. So in the scenario runs, that doesn't come through because the susceptibility of the basin to changes in climate is masked by socioeconomic change. And that's pretty much it for this graph. I think it's just shows the nice range, and that, for instance, while for individual rivers, for instance, some can have no socioeconomic change and no dam construction, but for those that do, it tends to be really significant, these direct anthropogenic influences. Finally, from these separate driver runs, we established which driver is actually key in the changes which we modeled over the century. So here you can see actually some geographical patterns. So if we look, for instance, at the USA, there's 3 deltas which have catchments totally or partially in the USA, and they are all the changes that we observed over the century are driven by climate change. And that's because there's no significant socioeconomic change projected over the century that would, flip the switch and affect significant change on sediment fluxes, but also there's no significant reservoir construction, and that's because in the USA they've mostly built in all of the good places for reservoirs already, and there's actually in some circles a drive for reservoir deconstruction, which crucially is not included in the reservoir scenarios that I constructed for the model, but that's a very interesting point to pick up on in the future. If we look to other areas of the globe on this map, for instance, if we look over to Asia, you see many more blue and red points, and those are, blue is socioeconomic driven and red is reservoir construction driven. So this is an area where anthropogenic changes over the century are projected to have a huge effect. And that seems like a good point to highlight here, the Mekong down here. And this is where I'm going to hand back to Steve to talk about the actual consequences of these changes, these observed and modeled changes for people who live in the deltas.
Okay, so thanks, Frances, and hopefully you can now see my screen again. Is that right? Have you got it? Thank you. I can see you nodding. All right. So yeah, why does this matter then? Okay. Well, now I am flipping into kind of case study mode rather than the kind of global perspective that Frances has just outlined for us, and specifically the Mekong. But although perhaps I'm biased given my interests in that part of the world, I do think the Mekong has some similarities with a number of other major deltas, not least in the fact that it's vitally important, not just locally, but globally indeed, in terms of it being a major agricultural area. the context here, I guess, is that with growing global populations and those populations becoming richer, changing their diets, it's projected that by 2050, the global demand for calories will increase by nearly 70%. And actually, of all the calories that are consumed on the planet at the moment, a fifth of those come from rice, which is grown, of course, in deltas like the Mekong, and many of the other major rice growing areas on the planet are other deltaic environments. And as we've suggested at the outset, these zones may be vulnerable to environmental change. So there's a real problem here if there is a close connection with adverse environmental change and adverse impacts on food production, then that can ripple out to all of us, not just the very many people that live in these places and rely on rice agriculture for their means of subsistence. Now, here we go. This is just to indicate the scale of rice production in the Mekong Delta. Anything that's pink or red on this map are different forms of rice cultivation. So you can see very, very large areas of the Mekong covered by this particular form of agricultural production. Now, what I want to do in this segment is really just show the quite intimate connection between sediment fluxes and agricultural productivity, particularly within the context of rice agriculture. But before doing that, I thought that I would just take a few moments to give you a quick fire virtual field trip of the Mekong to outline some of the specific stresses that it is facing. So here we are. Here's another satellite-based image, another SRTM image of the Mekong Delta. The red areas are flooded zones. So remember this area here in particular is somewhere that we're going to come back to. Notice, of course, that what happens is that all the flood waters dumped out into this part of the delta mean that flooding tends to attenuate as you go downstream, such that slightly counterintuitively, the coastal fringes tend to be drier than the area a little bit further inland. There's about 22,000 square kilometers of land within 2 meters of mean sea level in the Mekong Delta. That's an area that satisfyingly is almost exactly the size of Wales, which is, of course, the standard geographical unit of comparison. And as we've already mentioned, climate-driven sea level rise is clearly one of the drivers of environmental stress in this delta. So even if you believe that we're on a 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial pathway, which is the grey line here, we can see that we're anticipating around about 0.5 metre of sea level rise by the end of this century in terms of eustatic sea level rise. But as I mentioned at the start, the Mekong, like other major deltas, actually the major driver of relative sea level change is subsidence and anthropogenic subsidence in particular. So this is work by one of Francie's former colleagues at Utrecht, Philip Minderhood, showing past cumulative subsidence in the delta correlating essentially with areas of intense groundwater extraction. So we see around the Ho Chi Minh City area in particular, but also in these coastal areas where lots of groundwater usage is associated with aquaculture and other forms of irrigation, such that we have projected modeled subsidence rates at roughly where we are today of the orders of centimetres, not millimetres per year. So an order of magnitude more significant in terms of driving relative sea level change than the expansion of the oceans under greenhouse gas driven warming. The other major driver of change, of course, is what Francis has just been discussing. And the way that that plays out for the Mekong is that you can see that all these dots and squares within the Mekong basin are various reservoirs being constructed or planned for construction at different dates. You can see the timeline of total annual production in megawatt hours of hydropower here going up and up, and then a major transition in the last 20 years or so. And on the right-hand side, we can see the picture of declining sediment loads in the past and in the future. So just very briefly, for the period 1981 to 2005, we see a decline, albeit a gradual decline, driven mainly, as we've discussed in our prior work, by shifts in the position of tropical cyclone tracks over the basin. And then if we look into the future, specifically for the Mekong, again, this is Frances' sneak preview of her work with Philip, projecting out the changes as a result of climate change and damming scenarios. We see that gradual reduction through to about 2000, and then in the last 2 decades, coincident with that very rapid increase in hydropower capacity within the basin, we go off of a cliff edge in terms of sediment delivery to the delta. So remember, just to reiterate that point, last 2 decades, we've already had a shutting off of sediment delivery to the delta. Here's another stressor, the other aspect of sediment starvation in the Mekong is sand mining. Sand, of course, being removed from the channels at a pace in order to fuel cement development and construction in the cities in this region. And this is work by Greg Vasilopoulos and others at Hull University and elsewhere, showing the impacts of sediment starvation as a result of this decrease of sediment supply, as well as the direct extraction of sand, and the impact that that has on the increase in tidal extent within the Mekong Delta channels. And what you're looking at on this diagram is a series of scenarios. So if we fix bed levels at 1998 levels and just projected forward through time under rising sea levels associated with RCP 8.5, we see, of course, exactly what you'd expect: growing tidal extension, increasing tidal intrusion into the delta, but a very gradual one. But if we follow these other trajectories, then major drops in bed level as a result of this sediment starvation are actually the dominant, by far, driver of intrusion of the tidal system into the delta. So just for comparison, we see the black line here showing the difference in bed levels between 2018 versus 1998. And if we project forward under existing rates of sand mining to 2038, and then decided to mitigate that activity, you can see very, very significant changes in the extent of tidal intrusion being driven by this sediment exhaustion. So in these respects, declines in sediment load into the delta and the removal of sediment from the channels of the delta are all important in driving a series of processes that may affect agriculture. But the one that I particularly wanted to discuss today is the relationship between developments of water infrastructure within the delta and how that plays out in terms of rice agriculture. So on the left-hand slide here, on the left hand of the slide here, you see a map based on analysis of satellite imagery, mapping out zones of double cropped, that's the red areas, versus triple cropped, they are the blue areas, rice production. So just to talk you through that very, very quickly, double crop's really the traditional, if you will, method of rice cultivation in the Mekong Delta. It's an environment where you can get 2 crops of rice per year in an unmanaged environment. Then during the flood season, when the monsoon comes, the rice fields are inundated to a great extent. Remember that area of flooding that I highlighted on the SRTM. This is where we're dealing with here. And so for some months of the year, the fields lie fallow, they're replenished, the floods wipe out pests. And of course, the floods bring sediment, and with the sediment, the fine-grained sediments in particular, are vectors for nutrients. In contrast, triple cropping happens in areas of the delta where the water management infrastructure, in particular the presence of flood embankments, is such that you can exclude those monsoon floodwaters from your rice fields. And what that opens up is the possibility of not having that fallow period during the monsoon season, but instead pumping water in a controlled manner and growing a 3rd crop of rice during that, what would normally be a natural flood period. And then what you can see is that the government of Vietnam aggressively pursued a policy between 2000 and 2010 that was explicitly designed to increase not only flood protection in this naturally flooded zone of the delta up here, but also to greatly increase rice yields for export to people like me here in Europe and folks in the United States and elsewhere around the world, in order to generate some nice export revenue. And that policy was spectacularly successful by building a series of high flood embankments all over this part of the delta. Then within 10 years, what we've done is utterly transform the proportion of the rice growing area that was previously under double crop, the red areas, to triple crop, the blue areas. So now we're getting 3 crops a year instead of 2. All other things being equal, you increase your yields by 50%. But the consequence of that, of course, is that you, in building these high flood embankments, excluding the flood waters, then what you're also doing is not building up the delta land, you're not offsetting relative sea level rise, but you're also not replenishing these agricultural soils with the natural provision of nitrogen and other nutrients that will be carried down on those fine sediments and deposited onto these fields. And the thing to note here is that this transition in water infrastructure, this active decision to exclude sediment and water from these areas, is happening at exactly the same time, 2000 through to 2010, that the supply of sediments from upstream is also declining. So there's a double whammy of sediment reduction, sediment supply reduction to the surface of the delta in these environments in this decade and indeed the next decade. Now, how does that play out in terms of livelihoods, agricultural production, and nutrient systems? Well, this is something that a former postgraduate of mine, Alex Chapman, explored for his PhD by building this system dynamics model. And here you're seeing this tangled loop of noodles or spaghetti on this slide is a causal loop diagram indicating the relationships between different elements of what is effectively a very complicated social ecological system. So the browns here representing the biophysical component of the system, in things like sediment deposition, nutrient availability associated with that, and the replenishment of nutrients into the soils. We have a blue component here that's essentially the external economics of the system in terms of things like fertilizer application and so on. The red part is representing the system of agriculture and includes things like the technical capacity of individual farmers to manage their land. And then the greens are representing how much revenue is generated from the sale of that rice for a given yield, given external economic circumstances. So we have a model that enables us to interlink the sediments and nutrients, therefore, that are coming in at the top of the system with different forms of management within the delta, water management within the delta, and feed that through in terms of outcomes, in terms of livelihoods and rice yields. And we can operationalize that across the delta, as indicated by this cartoon. What we're doing is effectively running that system dynamics model in each of the individual flood compartments across the delta surface, each of which may have a slightly different land use, whether that's double crop, triple crop, or other forms of agricultural production. But that each of those system dynamic models within these flood compartments, that's the scale that we're working with, is being forced by the boundary conditions of sediment supply and nutrients. And of course, the sediment supply we've just heard about. And those sediments and nutrients then get spread out across the delta using some hydrodynamic modeling that colleagues in Vietnam at the Southern Institute for Water Resources Research are leading on. I should just say that this spatialized SDM is ongoing work with colleagues at Hull, at SIWRR and Canto University. So what I want to do on this next slide is just give you an example for one of these rice growing compartments about how this model system works. So here on the vertical axis, we've output metric is production efficiency. Essentially, this is the ratio of how much rice yield you get out versus how much input you have to put into that system. So in terms of your labor costs, all the other things that you have to do, and including the application of any artificial fertilizer. That production efficiency is just normalized by the maximum value so that we get a scale from 0 to 100 with just part of the range shown on this axis. We run that through time. We've run a series of simulations. So you're seeing the cloud here is the ensemble with the solid line showing the median value of the ensemble. And what we do is at this point in time, 2007, in these particular simulations, we switched the system from double cropping, that traditional method of rice growing, to triple cropping with our high flood embankments that are switching off this natural provisioning supply of nutrients from the sediments. So what I'm going to do is talk you through some rather interesting and complex system dynamics here. So what we see is that in the period before the switch, our system is kind of bouncing along, and there's some stochasticity in here because the system responds to randomness in external parameters like the global cost of fertilizer or farm machinery, labor prices, and so on. But on the whole, we have a slow and gradual increase in production efficiency, reflecting how farmers in this system are increasing their technical capacity over time. Then we switch to triple cropping, and what we see is that the median, the midpoint of the ensemble, starts to go up, increase a little bit relative to the prior rate of increase. And that's not surprising because, as I've noted, we have immediately an increase in rice yield, albeit offset we don't increase production efficiency by 50%, even though the yields go up by something like that, because that increase in output is offset by a big increase in input arising from the need to add fertilizers and all the additional costs associated with that change. Nonetheless, the production efficiency goes up. And this is important because what happens is that if you're an early uptaker of this new system, then the person who's not an early uptaker, immediately your next door neighbor notices that you're farming in a way that's apparently giving a better outcome. And so very quickly, everybody follows, and we very quickly have a near complete transition to triple cropping in this period. But notice, after about 5 or 6 years or so, the system reaches a tipping point and crashes. And of course, this is not surprising, because what's going on in this period is because we're no longer providing those free nutrients attached to the sediment, then we have to put more and more fertilizer in to reach a point where we can maintain the same yield. And eventually we deplete the nutrients in our soils to such an extent that the system collapses and production efficiency declines rapidly as a result of the loss of natural fertilizers. Then we can also map out how that system plays out under a range of different policy scenarios, therefore. So we have triple cropping, a policy scenario where we just continue that recent expansion. We can model out a system returning to the old ways, or we can explore variations on a theme. The 3-3-2 rotation is the idea that every 3 years, flooding a fallow period would be allowed, where farmers take a one-season break from their triple cropping to enable the natural replenishment again of those nutrients. We allow water and sediment back onto the land. And then this variation, the high flood year opening, is the idea that we open up the flood embankments, the sluice gates, in those years when there is a high flood. So this is similar to the 3-3-2 rotation, but also rather different because it's an adaptive strategy that follows the years of high flooding rather than locking into a fixed periodicity. So here on the next slide, and we're getting close to the end now, we can see how that plays out in this 2D space where we've got different outcomes mapped out onto the diagram under different policy and sediment load pathways. So on the one hand, the horizontal axis is how much tax revenue comes from exporting all that lovely rice out of Vietnam to overseas markets. So these are the tax dollars that the central government gets. So this axis is what our central policymakers are interested in. The vertical axis is the net disposable income after all costs, after you sell your rice and after you've bought all your fertilizers and machinery and labor and everything else. This is what your farmer earns on this axis. So this is what your farmer is interested in. Now, these results are for the mean farm size in the Mekong Delta. And for each of these 4 policies, 1, 2, 3, and 4, reflecting as labeled here, the arrows are showing us in effect a trajectory through time as our sediment supply to the Delta diminishes from pre-disturbance levels down to a near elimination of sediment loads. So you see that for things like the double cropping, we have a pretty good outcome for farmers. They're relatively well off, at least at the start of the process, but it's a poor outcome for the government. But over time, because of that diminished supply of nutrients, the outcome for the farmer gets poorer. Under triple cropping, we have a much better outcome for the government. It's not so good for the farmer because they've got greater costs with all those fertilizers, but there's no change over time, because effectively we're in a system here that's now completely divorced, completely disconnected from the natural sediment system of the delta. Under our policy number 2, the 332 rotation, notice again we have a decline in farmer income over time. This is because under this rotation, even with that rotation in the 3rd year, there is still declining nutrient levels. There's still a loss of that natural provisioning service. That means that the net income over time declines because of the need to buy all of that additional fertilizer to maintain productivity. Now, the 3rd scenario is quite interesting. This is the adaptive one, where you allow water onto the deltascape in the high flood years, a policy, I might add, that may sound quite familiar to many of you in the audiences. And notice that the restoration of those provisioning services means that both farmer income and rice export revenue, this is the only policy that enables both of those things to go up, even in the face of declining externally imposed sediment loads. So that's an interesting result. Now, on the next slide, you're going to see exactly the same thing, but for small farms, i.e. for smallholders, the poor people in the delta. So I'm just going to toggle to that now. And what you'll notice is that the key thing is that every outcome on this vertical axis is negative. So for smallholders, the poor people just get worse off under this scenario, under all of these scenarios. Basically, they all go bankrupt as a result of not having enough land to be able to farm in an efficient manner. All right, so just for my last slide, then what we can do is put all of that together into this kind of multi-dimensional space in a way that what we wanted to do here was to provide a visualization that policymakers might hopefully find useful. So we're mapping out 4 different axes of different outcomes. The success for poorer farmers, smaller small holdings, the wealthier farmers, those that cultivate larger areas of land. And then we've got the outcome in terms of efficiency of sediment reaching the floodplain. Remember the need to attempt to offset relative sea level rise. And then we've got the things that arguably the central government are interested in, how much profit they're getting from rice export. And on each of these axes, we've just normalized them using Z scores. So it's kind of a qualitative interpretation. And what you see is that there are very different outcomes for triple cropping, which obviously favors the rich and the government, versus double cropping, which favors smallholders and natural sediment services, versus these other adaptations to the water management system, which have trade-offs in effect between each of these different outcomes. Now, I don't want to sit here in this talk, maybe this is something for questions, and tell you what I think ought to be done here. The point about this is that with this kind of system dynamic modeling, you can produce these kind of results relatively quickly, relatively straightforwardly, provide information in a way that it might enable the policymakers to make difficult decisions about the nature of these trade-offs moving forward. Okay, I'm going to unshare my screen there and hand back to Frances for the last couple of slides in our talk on a couple of conclusions for you.
Thanks, Steve. I know Paul said we could have a little bit more than an hour, but I don't want to drag it out. So the conclusions. From my work at the start of the presentation, sediment delivery to deltas is projected to decrease globally by around, for the scenarios that I projected, 38%, which is huge. And dam construction alone causes most of that decrease. The decreases, as Steve has said, have a huge impact on societies in the deltas for multiple reasons, from the flood risk and the physical environment system to their influence on agriculture and livelihoods. And to be honest, all of that made me a bit kind of professionally hopeless, because if all of this this sediment is decreasing and that's what the delta is based on, and is there really any point? Is anything going to change? Can we actually do research which has a positive effect for these systems? But it is ongoing work, obviously. And there are many projects that we're both still doing. So Steve obviously presented ongoing work. I am also working on the Mekong, looking at scenarios of sedimentation. So if you're interested in that, please see my AGU presentation, which should be up early next month if you're attending, obviously remotely. Something else that's occurring on the Mekong in Utrecht here in the Water, Climate and Future Deltas Hub is this idea of solution spaces. So the concept is that there's a hypothetical space in which solutions can be found and society can exist in whatever form, and that can be projected into the future to enable appropriate management decisions from all aspects. So I'm contributing to the physical environment aspects, but you also have governance and law and economics, and which are all contribute and are factors in the solution space. Finally, next Friday, we're actually hosting online again a Delta Sedimentation Strategies workshop to discuss existing sedimentation strategies, things that are occurring and have occurred, and also the potential for knowledge transfer between deltas of these sedimentation strategies, and the success stories and what can actually make these sedimentation strategies successful, and what are the constraining factors. So with that, thank you all for listening and attending.
Oh, thank you, Francis and Steve. And this is a great talk. And Francis, thank you. I like particularly the term you used, professional hopeless. I have the same feeling, and like exactly the case study you're doing, the Mekong River Delta. We know the sediment decreased all the way from 160 million tons to now roughly only 20 million tons per year. And not only the sediment, of course, the saltwater intrusion, the subsidence, and coastal erosion, not only the shoreline, but even we found the subaqueous portion, the underwater portion also is eroding. So it's very some desperate. So I think, here I have a question, Jim, are you still there, Jim Best?
Yep. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Steve and Francis, for a fascinating talk. Just a couple of questions for Francis. I think when you were talking about the socioeconomic drivers, you said that richer nations basically would be the ones that they basically wouldn't bother taking any measures because they didn't need to. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, on the other hand, aren't the richer nations the ones that actually can afford to do that, so that would play into it? And sort of linked to that, when you think about where the finance is coming from for things like large hydropower schemes, a lot of that funding must be external to the country for some of the poorer nations. So how does that externality link into actually how you model what the socioeconomic drivers are? So two questions, Francis.
Yeah, good questions, thanks. So for the first one, I suppose it depends on your assumptions for future socioeconomic development. So it's not that, rich nations have done this, but they mostly didn't do it on purpose. The goal wasn't to stop sediment delivery to deltas, it was to maintain soil fertility and agricultural production mostly. So while they are technically better placed to make changes, they have a larger economic buffer and they could perhaps take the hit for the environment. I think on the whole, we haven't seen that occurs. They're not going to. People generally don't consider these long-term environmental changes when considering current land use and potential economic gain. I'm not saying that would never happen. I think we are seeing steps in that right kind of direction, but I think evidence is limited that governments of richer nations take the environment into account in any significant way. And for the second question, that's a very interesting point that I haven't really considered. Obviously, for this modeling, it was a very simple scenario, single timeline of reservoir construction. And one of the reasons for that is that the drivers of reservoir construction are hugely complex, as you probably know. It depends on not just financing and location, but often mostly politics and potentially the will of local people or the needs of the country. But I'm afraid I can't really contribute on the international finance aspects.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. In relation to the first point, I was just thinking about things like, retrofitting hydropower dams so that you increase sediment flushing efficiency. Those sorts of things presumably are going to be in the purview of countries who can actually afford that rather than countries that can't. So I on a sort of hopeful note, I'm just wondering whether there's a link between countries that are able to afford those measures and the prospect of actually increasing sediment flux beyond what it is now in very dammed catchments.
Yeah, I would hope so.
Okay, thanks for talking to you both.
Okay. With next. Any other question?
Oh, I'll go.
Yeah, Michael, go ahead.
All right. Yeah, I was, very interested in your 3 crop scenarios, because the management of that is going to be very different from what I see in Bangladesh, where so everybody grows crops during the monsoon season, and the additional second and third crop is usually during the dry season, where irrigation water is the limiting factor. And in fact, in some of the places where they've built the high embankments that limit the sedimentation, are only doing single cropping because they have saline groundwater. So the scenarios of whether that third crop is during the wet season and you're stopping the flooding, or during the dry season, seems to make a big difference. Can you comment on the difference in the agriculture pattern in Vietnam?
Well, no, if I take that one, or try to take that one, I think that observation's broadly correct, that there is a rather different kind of structure in the GBM versus the Mekong, for example. I mean, the thing to note about the Mekong rice growing area in Vietnam is that is a really, under natural conditions, before the flood embankments were there, that's what the phrase that the Vietnamese give that part of the delta is the deep flooded zone. Yeah. So there really are, during the wet season, quite significant inundation depths of 3 or 4 meters at the heights of the high embankments, which really preclude even with the kind of shallow embankment infrastructure growing much of anything in that period. So instead, the kind of like the natural livelihood system, if you will, or the more traditional livelihood system, is that the farmers would tend to adopt alternative livelihood practices during the flood season, whether that was fishing or perhaps moving to other parts of the delta, working as labourers, that kind of thing. And so it's just a slightly different structure to the 12-month calendar of when these crops are grown, I think.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, it's a little bit like the areas that are embanked in
Yeah,
some
yes.
of those. Yeah, they built the embankment to keep out the saline.
And certainly down when you move out of the deep flooded zone down towards what I call the coastal fringe, which doesn't really give it justice because it's still many tens of kilometres wide. That is an area that does feel a little bit more like Bangladesh in some respects, with much lower embankments, a mix of rice agriculture and shrimp farming and so on.
Okay, cool. Anybody? Steve, I have a question. You know, as Francis mentioned, the situation over the Mekong Delta is kind of very desperate, and it's kind of we know it's coming. It is happening, and but nothing we can do almost to stop the trend, the changing. And no, the sediment already very low. I mean, there's not too much space. It's only 20 million left. I mean, every year coming. So, I mean, the worst scenario is no sediment coming down. I mean, that's almost impossible happen. Maybe 10 million, maybe 15 million is no big difference. It's already very bad. I mean, is anything the government, the Vietnam government, try to, is any measure they try to apply to try to stop or deal with this situation? And this question associated with the other question, the same thing could also happen to Myanmar for the Irrawaddy, or even Bangladesh against the Brahmaputra. The situation is not that bad as Mekong, but it's coming. So any lesson for those, the Myanmar and Bangladesh, they can learn from the Mekong case. Mekong is kind of like a hopeless. We know like a landslide is happening. We are looking at it, it's coming down, it's sliding, nothing we can stop it.
Yeah, okay, well, it's very interesting how you've constructed that question. So let me try and unpack it. I rarely like to use the phrase hopeless unless that really is justified. So I don't think I'd ever want to say things are hopeless, but I do think it's important that for the Mekong, people understand that this transition to sediment starved, it's already happened. Okay, so we have a sediment starved system, and I think that there are two implications that follow from that. The first is that the only way to get that sediment back is by having a marginal improvement in the way in which existing reservoirs are managed in order to bypass a little bit more of the sediment through the system. All right, so that's the first thing, but that requires significant negotiation among multiple actors across multiple boundaries. And that is, I think, where things might begin to get a little hopeless, okay, or more challenging, let's say. The second thing is that what I would say is that I think what our work shows is that in a sediment-starved environment, if you're the Vietnamese authorities at the bottom of this chain of thousands of kilometers of river, then every, never mind tons, but every gram of sediment matters, okay? And when you're managing the system in the way that it was in the early 2000s, you're deliberately excluding, you're making a choice to deliberately exclude all the whatever sediment is left in the system. So I think the most critical thing that could be done to help in a transition to a more sustainable Mekong Delta is to manage the flows of water and sediment in Vietnam in a slightly more sensible way. And I think here there is hope, because actually the Vietnamese authorities have already worked this out. And they're talking about moving back to double cropping and actually diversifying their economy. A lot of the talk at provincial level in Vietnam is about having beautiful floodwaters with lotus plants growing everywhere and drawing in people from Saigon on day trips and week-long trips for photography and ecotourism. So this idea of restoring the Delta I think is gaining a little bit of traction amongst some of the provinces. So there's a little bit of optimism there.
Okay.
Right, now that's the first thing. Now, Myanmar, I think the lesson there, which is what you asked, is don't repeat the mistakes that, because the trajectory in Myanmar is maybe a little bit behind in terms of where they are on that development curve. And also, the Myanmar authorities have got the advantage, haven't they, that they're not dealing with a transnational river system.
Yeah.
So the big lesson is don't dam, or more accurately, I think, don't dam in the way that the Mekong was dammed, where you build dams that don't pass sediment, that are incredibly difficult to retrofit for that process, and don't do silly things like disrupt the flows of sediment out of the delta channels onto the delta plains. In places like the Irrawaddy Delta, which incidentally, before this talk, I looked in my grocery cupboard downstairs, and the packets of rice from Lidl and Aldi all come from Myanmar rather than Vietnam. So I couldn't use them as a prop for this talk. But there you go. I think that's the lessons for Myanmar in my opinion.
Good. But James, I think you raise your hand. Okay. You have some question? James, perhaps?
Yeah, so I just had another question for Steve. Steve, on that graph showing sort of, I think it was efficiency of rice production. I can't remember, it sort of went up to a peak and then it seemed to plunge after, where it was 2016, was it?
Yeah, let me just see if I can.
I wasn't sure whether I wasn't sure whether that was the date when your paper came out, so I wonder whether there's a causal relationship. But the second thing I was wondering was, given that, and now we're in 2020, what evidence is there that production efficiency has gone down to those levels that you've got there of 75?
Yeah, okay. Understood. That's a good question. So no, this is just modeled for one particular kind of typical flood compartment, these areas of a few hectares in Anjiang province, which is in that deep flooded zone. And we just happened to do these timelines because that was the point at which the switch was made. Now, I think that there's maybe a couple of ways to answer your question. So the precise onset of this transition will therefore be slightly different at different points across the landscape. But one of the very interesting things that Alex has done subsequently is that he's looked at out-migration data from these different areas of the Delta. And what's fascinating is that people in this talk won't be surprised to learn that there is very significant out-migration of people from or at least there was before COVID, which is a different story. There's very significant out-migration from these provinces, and you can almost map with a very high confidence areas of intense out-migration match to the onset of triple cropping plus about 6 or 7 years with a remarkable consistency. And I actually forgot to mention this point during the talk. That's why I kind of emphasize that sort of 5 to 6 year time scale. Now, obviously that's kind of not a precise mechanistic link, and nor do we have the detailed data to do a precise validation on nutrient and fertilizer inputs within these areas. But I think there's a nice bit of kind of circumstantial evidence that this kind of broad system dynamics, we're probably picking it up reasonably well.
Is the out-migration purely linked to that change to the third cropping then, Steve, or other factors?
Well, of course, there are migration. I mean, I'm not a migration expert, but there are multiple factors that are bound to be driving that. But, you know, our simulations do show that these, particularly the smallholder farmers, they're going bust under this system. They can't afford the fertilizers. They're taking out loans to purchase that material that keeps them going for a little while. And then eventually they do need to go and seek alternative livelihoods, it seems.
Okay.
Okay, many thanks.
Also very, in some ways, depressing example of a really strong connection between this, the value of sediment as a provisioning ecosystem service, with, of course, the sediment being a vector for nutrients in this case.
Okay.
Valuing that dirt, basically.
Okay, thanks. You know, Frances, there's a question from Julius for you.
Yeah, I see from Jules. So the question is about the key limitations of BQuart for estimating sediment. And I would say it's in the assumptions to do with the anthropogenic factor. So it's a very simple approach that works approximately globally, but for individual basins, it will not necessarily hold, because there's not really a reason why, when countries get richer, that they would follow this curve. They don't have to. They could make other choices. It's just that in the past, it seems that this is what has happened. So I think that's the key limitation. It's this assumption on where these changes happen with regards to population density and wealth, and that they happen at all, and that it's not inevitable because it's just anthropogenic activities, and you could change it.
Okay.
Could I follow up, Francis? What would you sort of advocate as a better way of accounting for that anthropogenic factor? Any thoughts there?
I think there's a lot of ways. If we're still talking about the global modeling, I know Sagi Cohen, who created the original model, he's been working with specific land use data, and I think that's probably a good way to go if you still want to use these large data sets in a global model, because it's slightly more exact. It actually tells you what's going on the land. But the ideal is to look at individual basins and their individual communities and governments, and construct your own scenarios based on what's likely to happen, considering the societies and economics in the individual basins.
Maybe I could just add to that as well, just very quickly, if that's all right. I think that, I mean, you're quite right to focus on the limitations of BQR. One of those limitations, of course, is that it's an empirical function that's based off of data that was collected in many cases decades ago. And we see on places like the Mekong and elsewhere that actually the landscapes have been completely transformed in that period. So it seems to me that we kind of need a major rethink about these kinds of empirical approaches, and maybe things like the advent of global satellite-based remote sensing to retrieve suspended sediment transport estimates. Maybe that opens up the possibility to really reappraise these sediment functions that are used in these global scale models. But you know, that's a whole 3-year research program right there.
Okay, cool. Thank you guys, Frances and Steve. And it's a great, I think, a great dialogue. And you know, that's the international community depth, and particularly those local Delta government will benefit to this kind of discussion. So on next week, we have 2 more talk regarding the Himalaya rivers. One is the Ganges Brahmaputra given by Steve Goodbread on Wednesday, and Friday, Peter Clift talk about the Indus River. I think both are very interesting, very important major river system. Please mark your calendar, come back at the same time. And so if you know any other question, I think, thank you very much for attending, and thank you for this great joint talk. Steve and Francis, it's very nice. We should talk about more, we should hook up what your data coming down from the source, and also what we found in the nearshore area, and also subaqueous, on the delta portion. It should be very interesting.